The paper cup had gone cold in her hands. At 7:16, on a Tuesday evening, a woman sat in the back row of a small support group. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say all afternoon, in the shower, on her drive, and in the parking lot outside, where she sat for 10 minutes with the engine off, just trying to breathe. Now, the fluorescent light above her flickered once, and as she opened her mouth to speak, she wished she hadn't come at all. She kept rubbing the edge of her wedding ring without noticing. Her chest felt tight, the way it always did right before she was about to say something true. She had spent years being the version of herself that everyone expected. Composed, capable, fine. She answered the phone the same way every time. "I'm okay. Things are good. Just busy." The words came out so smoothly now that she sometimes forgot they weren't entirely true. Nobody laughed at her. They just couldn't understand her. Isolation doesn't scream. It goes quiet. Across the room, a woman she had never met began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, uncertain, the kind of voice that had learned to apologize before it even finished a sentence. The details of her story were different, a different loss, a different year, a different life entirely. But something in the way she described the aftermath, the strange flatness that follows a private kind of grief, made the room disappear for a moment. Then 2 words left her mouth before she could stop them. "Me too." Something happened in that instant that neither of them could see, but both of them felt, almost immediately. Shoulders dropped. Breathing slowed. A weight that had felt permanent suddenly felt shared. The meeting ended not long after. People folded their chairs, refilled their coffee, said quiet goodnights. The woman with the paper cup didn't remember most of the drive home. She remembered the streetlights passing in long orange streaks across her windshield. She remembered turning the radio off because she didn't want any sound competing with the strange, unfamiliar quiet inside her chest. She noticed something odd when she got home. She wasn't rehearsing the conversation in her head, replaying it, editing it, worrying over what she should have said differently. For months, that had been her nightly ritual, an exhausting rerun that kept her awake long after she'd turned off the lights. That night, she simply made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and let the silence be ordinary again. She slept, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without waking at 3 in the morning. Nothing about her life had changed. The situation she'd been carrying for years was still exactly where she'd left it. And yet, something in her had shifted, quietly and without her permission, the moment someone else confirmed. She wasn't the only one who had felt this way. What actually happens inside the brain the exact moment isolation turns into connection? To find out, neuroscientists at UCLA placed participants into brain scanners to isolate emotional pain. What they found reshaped everything. The brain processes social rejection and isolation using the exact same neural circuitry it uses for physical injury. That explains why, without meaning to, she had stopped gripping the paper cup so tightly. To the brain, being alone with something painful doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It registers as a threat, the same category of threat as a wound that needs tending. Think about what that means for a moment. It means the ache of feeling misunderstood isn't only metaphorical. It isn't just a turn of phrase. Somewhere in the oldest architecture of the brain, emotional isolation is filed under the same heading as physical danger, which raises an obvious question. If isolation is processed like an injury, what happens when that injury is finally acknowledged by someone else? She looked around the room that night, before she'd fully processed what she'd just heard. Nobody spoke, then someone smiled. "I thought there was something wrong with me," the woman said. The other woman, the one who had spoken first, smiled back. "So did I." That's the strange part. Your brain doesn't wait to see whether the problem gets solved. Research suggests that hearing genuine recognition can reduce the brain's perception of social threat, helping the nervous system begin to calm, often before a single thing about the actual situation has changed. It starts calming down the moment it realizes someone else has survived it. Oxytocin plays a central role here. Research published through the National Institutes of Health has documented that oxytocin release increases during moments of mutual disclosure, working alongside the vagus nerve to slow the heart and quiet the body's stress response. Scientists have described this as a tend and befriend pattern, a survival strategy built not around fighting or fleeing, but around moving toward each other when things feel dangerous. It's worth sitting with that for a second. For most of the history of psychology, relief was assumed to follow resolution. First, you fix the problem. Then, you feel better. But this research suggests something almost backward. That sometimes the body starts to recover before the situation does, simply because it no longer believes it's facing the danger by itself. That single idea would come to matter to someone else in a very different room a few years earlier, years before that Tuesday evening. A man named Daniel sat in his truck in his own driveway, engine off, both hands still on the wheel. He had been sitting there for almost 40 minutes. Inside the house, his wife was making dinner, unaware that the business Daniel had spent 11 years building had quietly collapsed that afternoon. The final call had come just after lunch. A supplier pulling out, a loan he couldn't restructure, numbers that no longer worked no matter how many times he ran them. He had known for weeks it was coming. Knowing hadn't made it easier to say out loud. He kept rehearsing the sentence. We lost the business. 4 words. He had said harder things in his life. He couldn't understand why these 4 wouldn't come. Part of him, he later admitted, thought that if he just waited long enough in the driveway, some version of the day would rearrange itself. That the numbers might look different tomorrow. That he could postpone the conversation until it wasn't true anymore. It never stopped being true. Eventually, he went inside, and the conversation happened, and life reorganized itself around a loss that took years to fully absorb. The house they eventually sold, the noise of a life quietly downsizing, the small, humiliating adjustments nobody prepares you for. Friends tried to help the way friends usually do. You'll bounce back. Everything happens for a reason. This will make you stronger in the end. Daniel appreciated every one of these sentences. None of them reached him. Each one, in its own well-meaning way, rushed past the place where he actually was, and arrived somewhere further down the road, a place he hadn't gotten to yet, and wasn't sure he ever would. Months later, at a small community meeting he almost didn't attend, an older man he had never met sat down beside him after the group had mostly emptied out. Daniel had spoken for nearly 10 minutes without planning to, describing the driveway, the 40 minutes, the 4 words he couldn't say. The room went quiet. Finally, the older man spoke. I remember sitting in my truck, he said, because I couldn't bring myself to tell my wife we'd lost everything. Daniel turned to look at him. I sat there for almost 2 hours, the man continued. I kept rehearsing the conversation. I thought if I waited long enough, maybe it wouldn't be true. Daniel didn't remember much else from that meeting. He didn't need to. Those 2 sentences had already answered a question that had been sitting in his chest for months. Was I the only one? The answer was no. Notice what the older man never did. He never explained what I needed. He never explained how to rebuild a business. He never offered a 5-step plan for financial recovery. He didn't tell Daniel it would all work out. He simply handed over a memory. And somehow, that was enough to change how Daniel carried the rest of his own. There is a massive gap between being cared for and being truly understood. That gap is where quiet suffering lives. It's also why our brains are wired with mirror neurons. Cells that fire not just when we feel an emotion, but when we witness someone else feeling it. It's a system for borrowed experience. When you see someone else's chest tighten with grief, your nervous system quietly rehearses that exact same pain alongside them. This same pattern of recognition shows up again and again in rooms that have nothing to do with business or grief support circles. An elderly widower once described the hardest part of losing his wife of 54 years. Not the funeral, not the immediate weeks afterward when the house was full of casseroles and visitors, but months later on ordinary Sunday mornings when the house was quiet and the coffee maker only needed to make half as much as it used to. Nobody understood why Sundays hurt, he said, at a gathering he'd been reluctant to attend. Another man across the table, a widower himself, nodded slowly. Sunday mornings were the hardest for me too, he said. Nothing more needed to be said. Neither man reached for a solution. They simply sat with the shared shape of an ordinary morning that had quietly become unbearable for the same private reason. The same recognition shows up in entirely different rooms, among entirely different kinds of pain. A woman fighting her way through her health crisis. Once admitted, almost embarrassed by the confession, that she had spent an entire year of her ordeal smiling at doctors, nurses, and visitors, performing a version of calm she didn't feel. I smiled at everyone the whole time, she said. I was terrified. Another survivor in the room didn't hesitate. I did the exact same thing, she said. I thought if I looked strong enough, it would somehow make it true. Different battles, different years, different hospitals, the same private performance, and the same quiet relief in discovering someone else had performed it too. This pattern is old enough and consistent enough across such different kinds of pain that it raises a larger question. Why would something so specific, the comfort of hearing "me too," be so universal across grief, illness, failure, and fear? If you think this deep need for connection is just a human vulnerability, look closer at the world around us. This instinct is hardwired into our survival. When an elephant in a herd is injured or distressed, the others don't leave it behind. They gather close, gently pressing their trunks against it, lowering their voices into soft, rumbling tones. There is no language, no explanation, just presence. Similar findings have come from research on rats conducted at the University of Chicago. In these studies, a free rat was given a choice: eat a piece of chocolate alone in a separate compartment, or free a trapped, visibly distressed companion first. In a striking number of trials, the free rat chose to release its companion before eating anything at all, even though nothing was offered in exchange for the rescue. Scientists studying the behavior have suggested it reflects an empathic response that runs deep across mammalian species, likely far older than human language. Your brain is still that rat. It is still that elephant. It knows, on a cellular level, that being left alone in the dark is an evolutionary death sentence. If that instinct runs deep enough to override a rat's own appetite, deep enough to bring an entire elephant herd to a standstill around one grieving member, it suggests that comfort itself may not be a cultural invention at all. It may be closer to a biological inheritance, something natural selection preserved, because animals who stayed close to one another during distress were, generation after generation, more likely to survive it. For most of human history, a person separated from the group wasn't just lonely. They were exposed. Food became harder to find alone. Danger became harder to detect alone. Research from the University of Chicago's Social Neuroscience Lab, associated with the late psychologist John Cacioppo, spent decades documenting the physical cost of chronic loneliness in humans: disrupted sleep, elevated stress hormones, weakened immune response over time. The body, it turns out, still expects company as a baseline condition. It treats the absence of connection as a kind of ongoing danger, whether or not modern life agrees that it should. Which means that when someone says, "me too," they may be answering a much older question than the one being asked out loud. Not simply, "do you understand my situation?" but something closer to, "am I safe here?" Every generation believes its struggles are unique to it. Every era assumes its particular grief, its particular shame, its particular fear has never quite been felt this way before. And yet, strip away the different circumstances, the different decades, the different diseases, the different disasters, and what remains is almost always the same handful of human experiences repeating themselves quietly across centuries. Fear, shame, grief. The suspicion that everyone else has somehow figured out how to survive being human, except for the person currently struggling to. Perhaps this is why storytelling itself has endured for as long as it has, in every culture, long before anyone called it psychology. Around fires, in villages, in rooms with folding chairs and paper cups, people have always gathered to trade the same handful of sentences. "I've been there. I remember. I survived." Not because the details matched, because the feeling did. That evening, the woman left the meeting, carrying the same paper cup she'd walked in with, now empty, slightly crushed at the rim where she'd been turning it in her hands. The cup hadn't changed. Neither had her past. But, for the first time in years, walking to her car under the same flickering parking lot lights, she wasn't carrying it alone. Somewhere today, someone is sitting in a version of that same room. A waiting room, a parked car, a quiet kitchen, at the end of a long day, believing that what they're feeling is theirs alone to carry. They aren't waiting for a lecture. They aren't waiting for a 5-step plan to fix their life. They're just waiting for someone to look them in the eye and quietly say, "Me too." Because sometimes, the weight begins to lift long before the problem gets solved. It starts the moment you realize you aren't facing it alone.